Welcome to the GOVIT Podcast, Tech Trends episode on the IPv6 federal mandate and creating a checklist for the transition plan. I'm joined as always by the ever knowledgeable Ryan. Thanks for joining me today again, Ryan.
Thank you, Jolene, for having me.
And so today, like I said, we're going to dive into something that's been on the radar for a lot of people. It's a hot topic these days, the USGv6 profile for transitioning to IPv6. Can you explain why this is such a critical issue at this point?
Yeah, good question, Julian. So, as we know, the internet is expanding. The traditional IPv4 addresses are running out. So IPv6 provides a solution to this. But the transition, isn't just about increasing address space. It's about, ensuring future-proofing interoperability and security. And for federal agencies, adhering to the USGv6 profile is crucial in this journey.
So it's interesting because this actually touches on some of the things that we've talked about in the past when we discussed Wi-Fi 6E and when we discussed the National Cybersecurity document that we covered back in March. The Wi-Fi 6E discussion, we talked about, Internet of Things and how we started out with just a couple of devices on our local network. And then all of a sudden realizing, we have like 20, 30 devices on our home networks and even more in our offices. And then, of course, the security aspect that's covered by the National Cybersecurity document. So it's interesting to see these things coming together and cybersecurity and the sort of future development of the internet's becoming obviously a much hotter priority for the government. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, scalability is definitely an issue. That's a big reason why we're having this big push in following the USGv6 profile.
So why don't we, talking about the transition, let's have a discussion about what an implementation process might look like. How would a federal agency, begin the process of transitioning to IPv6?
Well, the first step is really the executive buy-in, and policy establishment. It's crucial to have, the commitment from top management for IPv6 adoption, as part of the agency's strategic IT initiative, as well as, policy mandating the use of the USGv6 profile in all future procurements and upgrades to support IPv6. Also, an IPv6 transition manager to oversee policy adherence, coordinate the efforts, and report progress can streamline the process.
And so, the buy-in from top-level management, that's sort of a given that we're going to need to have that. What does a procurement policy look like? What does that entail?
So that's really kind of mandating the use of IPv6 moving forward on any future procurements to make sure that you are buying, hardware, et cetera, kind of that already have IPv6 capability.
And then, it's there are some obvious benefits to having someone manage the transition process and be a point person, to streamline things and keep everything on track. Is that someone who would be appointed internally or someone brought in from, outside as a consultant?
I've seen both. So it's really good to have that internal management structure because it's definitely going to be an ongoing transition for, multiple years. But you can, outsource that to a company like Converge One Government Solutions.
So what's the next step? After we have buy-in, we've got a procurement policy, and we have someone in place to manage the process. Where do we really start getting the wheels turning on this?
Well, that's when the fun kind of starts. So, assessment of the inventory. In order to understand the current state of the agency's IT infrastructure, we'll want to conduct a full inventory of the existing network, all the applications, services, to determine overall IPv6 readiness. Then we'll kind of map out which aspects of the USGv6 profile apply to various components of the agency's IT environment.
So that's essentially identifying, what needs to happen, taking a look at what's IPv6 compliant and what isn't, and that helps you determine, where you need to perform upgrades or changes in hardware. I would assume the next step in the process, now that we know what we need to do, is to plan it all out, right?
Correct, absolutely. So the planning process, for the IPv6 transition is a structured approach that, kind of begins with the planning and design phase. Our goal in this phase is to create an IPv6 adoption roadmap, which delineates a detailed project plan complete with timelines, milestones. It's really essential for the transition. At the same time, there's an emphasis on architectural design. where we focus on drafting an IPv6 compliant network architecture, that meets the criteria that's set forth by the USGv6 Profile, ensuring every component is up to the standard. A lot of this time is really kind of spent with the dual stack configuration as well.
That all makes a lot of sense in terms of procedurally how we go from those preliminary steps to identifying what needs to happen, to planning it all out. I'm sure there's a lot of equipment and costs and resources out there that make this a pretty costly endeavor, right? So how do we, what's the process look like to make sure that the plan that we've come up with is actually going to work and maximize resources and possibly identify future roadblocks and things like that?
Well, that's kind of when we really look at the pilot project phase, to really test and redefine the principles of implementation strategies in a controlled setting. So following the roadmap's establishment, the process kind of shifts to the procurement phase. That's a pretty critical step, which involves updating all the vendor requirements that align with the new IPv6 standards, vetting the vendors for compliance, adding the USGv6 compliance clauses into contracts, therefore ensuring that every aspect of the transition is in harmony with the mandate.
So when you talk about these pilot projects, that's kind of like, what we've talked about in the past with staging environments or, staging changes before rolling them out, into production environments. Is that pretty much the same idea that we're talking about here?
Yeah. So, you really want to be able to test full functionality in a controlled environment to make sure when you make those changes on the production network that everything goes nice and smooth. So it just gives you that ability to do full run tests, and you can add tools for verification as well.
So let's take a step back for a second, if you don't mind, because something crossed my mind that interests me. I'm wondering what gave rise to the mandate specifically, because we talked earlier about Wi-Fi 6E, which is sort of a natural progression technologically, but we have the National Cybersecurity Document, which was an obvious response to the fact that we have these ever evolving threats, in the online landscape, and we want to protect individuals, domestically and in the digital realm. So what gave rise to IPv6 specifically being, a focus, point of focus at this point?
Yeah, well, the federal mandate, began a big push from the Office of Management and Budget, back in 2005, which required that by 2008, all federal agencies ensure that their network backbones were IPv6 capable. Later on, a bunch of additional requirements came out, to ensure that the federal information systems involved, to use IPv6.
Right. So with the evolution of these requirements, how does that affect procurement? That's something we've talked about a couple of times in this conversation, and we talked about procurement policy. Are there any certifications or anything like that predetermined that affect, what kind of hardware is being used or anything to that effect?
Yeah. So part of that includes the approved product list, so otherwise known as the APL. Which states that anything new hardware and applications being added to the APL need to be IPv6 compliant. Ensuring that the products are compliant means that the federal agencies are better positioned to make the transition smoothly and can take full advantage of the benefits of IPv6.
So that makes sense, and I think this is probably a good place for us to break it off today, because we still have a few things to cover. We're going to dive a little bit more deeply into procurement. But then also into training and skills development, because there's a lot that needs to happen there in terms of bringing staff up to speed on IPv6 and also training the end users. So we'll come back next week and talk about that more in depth. That sound good?
Sounds good to me.
All right. Thanks so much for your time today, Ryan. And everyone, please, like, share, and comment down below. And we'll see you again next time. Ryan, thank you again for joining me today.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Have a great day, everybody.